Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing the limitation of expansionary fiscal policy. Now, in your exam question, you might be asked to explain how effective fiscal policy is, and discuss the effectiveness, argue about the effectiveness of expansionary fiscal policies to bring the economy out of recessions and growth. And we know that expansionary fiscal policy refers to the increased government spending and or reduced taxation to stabilize the economy, and these are discretionary fiscal policies which require active fiscal stabilization to sort of stabilize the economy and bring the economy out of recession, right, and to promote more economic growth and reduce cyclical unemployment and demand deficit unemployment. That's why fiscal policy is used, and it's more of a Keynesian approach because John Maynard Keynes advocated for expansionary fiscal stabilization, that the government should actively increase government spending to bring the economy out of recessions, right? Now, so while expansionary fiscal policy is very useful in stabilizing the economy, it is not without its limitations. But one mistake students do is in answers, right? When they're writing about the disadvantage, when they are writing about fiscal policy has disadvantages, they make it sound like it's a bad thing. Just because a policy has certain limitations doesn't make the policy ineffective. So when you're writing about its disadvantages or its limitations, don't make it sound like it's a bad thing, because every policy, whether it's any policy, always has limitations. But that doesn't mean that we don't implement them, because those policies are effective as well. Now, whether that policy will end up being a complete government failure or not, that we'll discuss in evaluation. Now, especially when you're mentioning or you are arguing on the narrative that fiscal policy is effective, you will say that it has certain limitations, such as it brings inflationary pressures, because when you increase government spending, the G component of AD goes up, and even if you reduce taxes such as income taxes or corporate taxes, disposable income goes up and retained profits go up, which increases consumption spending and subsequently investment spend. Retained profits goes up, so investment spending goes up as well. So the C component and the I component of aggregate demand goes up because of expansionary fiscal policy, which causes a rightward shift of aggregate demand, resulting into your demand pull inflationary pressures, right? So you can make your Keynesian diagram, and you can talk about how demand pull inflation happens because of an expansionary fiscal policy. But this is a limitation because we're calling it a limitation because obviously not all people would be. Not all We don't have equal income groups in societies, right? So some are rich, some are poor. So the very poor people might be affected. So we know that. So again, that will bring some inflationary pressures, although we I mean, this sort of an inflationary pressure is not deemed or inherently harmful, especially when the economy was already in a very deep recession. So some demand for inflation because of expansionary fiscal policy is not a bad. It's desirable, and the government would end up making that trade-off, right, and accepting that as the economy's fate regarding expansionary fiscal policy. But the thing is that some very very poor people might still face higher cost of living because of those inflationary pressures. The second thing that you can actually mention over here is, I'm calling it 1A, is about the widening of the current account deficit. So the current account deficit would actually widen because you see what happens is, if you guys must have studied under a current account causes of a current account deficit, that current account deficit could be caused due to very strong domestic demand in the economy. And the objective of expansionary fiscal policy is to create that strong expansionary demand through active fiscal stabilization and to increasing government spending and reducing taxes. So because of expansionary fiscal policy, economic growth takes place, and economic growth results in higher national incomes, and the people would start importing more, could start importing more. So it could result into it's not that it will always result into, but it could result into a current account deficit widening, especially if you already have a deficit. It's because there would be some sucking in of imports effect. We know that imports are sucked in the economy because of higher domestic demand in the economy due to growth. And this you can say that might not be desirable especially for poor developing countries, because the deficit just sort of widens, and you're already aware of the negative consequences of the current account deficit because we've already discussed them significantly in our previous videos as well. So we know what challenges could a current account deficit bring into the macroeconomy or the aggregate economy, right? The second thing, students, you're supposed to mention is about the deterioration of government finances, because obviously if you're increasing government spending, that requires government's finances. And we know that expansionary fiscal policies would cost the economy billions and billions of dollars or rupees or pounds, where that because so And we know that expansionary fiscal policy means that the government would enact a budget deficit, or the government would ultimately run into a budget deficit, or if it already has a budget deficit, then that budget deficit would be widened, and the government would need to borrow money. And the government borrows money through issuing government bonds to commercial banks, and the government borrows from the domestic economy basically. And I already have a video on the budget deficit and the national debt. You guys can check that out, but I will also be posting on the portal for my existing students as well. So now the point what I'm trying to say is that if you have a current account, if you have if the economy runs a budget deficit, because it has to borrow money, because it has to technically borrow money to spend money in a budget deficit, especially if you're going for an expansionary fiscal policy. And the funding, if you're borrowing money that to fund your government finances, to fund your government spending, that could carry a severe opportunity cost as well. Because if the money that you're borrowing, if you're borrowing, you need to ultimately repay back that money to the domestic economy back, right? Because you're borrowing from the domestic economy, right? The government is borrowing money from the domestic economy by issuing bonds. So ultimately what happens is that causes a rise in debt, and the government, and so in order to repay back that money, the government would increase taxes in the future to pay back that debts that it has gathered. And if, let's say, that the government increases indirect taxes, which are already regressive in nature, such as value added tax or fuel duties, these taxes could increase to sort of repay back the debt. Or even let's say it's not just, even if your government is spending more, if the government spending is going up, and the government knows that it is running into a deficit, and let's say if it tries to somehow reduce that deficit by increasing taxes, so that it could get some collect some more money from the domestic economy through taxes, then if those taxes are regressive, in order to fund the government spending, if those taxes are regressive, then that could firstly result into disproportionately affect the poor, because we know that the poor would suffer from worsening income inequality, which is, and income inequality is again a macroeconomic objective. So again, the poor would suffer. And yes, also guys, the government could increase income taxes in the future to finance the government spending that it is doing right now. Because obviously the finances, expansionary fiscal policy means that the government finances would deteriorate, because the government would need to spend a lot of money that it has collected in taxes to fund that spending, and it won't really have a lot of money available, so it will run into a budget deficit. And even if it increases taxes to reduce that deficit, ultimately it will need to borrow money. So the government knows that, especially in a recession, it has to allow that budget deficit to happen, right? And even if so, let's say, in order to finance the government spending, the government increases taxes such as income taxes in future. Very high income taxes could disincentivize people to work, and people would exit the labor force then, which would reduce your quantity of the labor force, reducing the productive capacity and shifting your long run aggregate supply to the left. LRAS will shift to the left, especially if the people exit from the labor force, reducing the size of the labor force, right? Which could affect long-term growth rates. And also, if the government is increases corporate taxes in the future too, because it is currently, its government finances have deteriorated because of enacting an expansionary fiscal policy in 2025, and let's say later on in the next year it increases its taxes to sort of bring back the government finances on a stable position, and it increases corporate taxes, so that very high corporate taxes could disincentivize investments, which will, the I component is affected severely, which would affect economic growth, because investment is a component of AD. So AD would fall in the long run, which is going to be not good for the economy. So the improvements that we have done right now in the economy through boosting growth could be subsequently offset by a reduction in AD and growth in the future. And we also know that investments has an impact on the long run aggregate supply of an economy. So LRAS could shift to the left as well, inwards, especially if private sector massively gets disincentivized from higher corporate taxes. So productive capacity could fall as well. So you could mention this as well. Now I'm assuming that you're already aware of these diagrams by now, right? So I'm not drawing these diagrams. And also, if the government borrows debt, especially by issuing government bonds, it has to pay very high interest on these bonds to to whoever who buys these bonds, right? So there's high debt interest. Not only does the national debt goes up, but the interest on these debt goes up as well. So the government has to pay high debt interest because it has borrowed, and paying high debt interest means that again the government finances would be used, and it has an opportunity cost involved because other areas of spending needs to might be compromised, right? And like I said, to counter all of this, because the government isko kehte hain basically, this is basically, so guys, this is basically known as a budget deficit fueled fiscal stimulus. It's called economists also call it, and this is a very good word that you can use. It's a nice fancy word, deficit budget deficit fueled means that it is the government is running into that deficit. It knows it allows that deficit to happen, so it's a budget deficit fueled fiscal stimulus, right? So a budget deficit fueled fiscal stimulus would increase aggregate demand and growth, which will people say that if you have a budget deficit fueled fiscal stimulus and that is straining government finances and the government is borrowing money to fill that deficit, and you know um, probably also thinking about increasing taxes in the future because its government finances are deteriorating. Not right now increasing taxes, because right now you're into an expansive fiscal policy, so probably in the later on in the future if it increases taxes, but that's if and buts. But what we're saying is that you have a budget deficit and you have to borrow money to spend money because you need to fill that gap. If you're spending $5 million, and if you plan to spend $5 million, but there's only $3 million in tax revenue, so you need which is a 2 million budget deficit, you need to borrow 2 million from by issuing government bonds. That would raise debt, and the government would need to repay back that debt. It needs to pay back this money along with interest. So again, which means that, so we are saying, but however, economists also place a counter argument to this. They say that a budget deficit fueled fiscal stimulus would, in the long run, later on, it would increase aggregate demand and growth, and higher growth would mean higher incomes, and higher income means automatically large amount of income tax revenues would be generated. Also, higher economic growth means higher corporate profits for the firms as well. So over time, more corporate tax revenues would be generated. So what economists say is that increasing AD and growth would generate higher income and profits over time, which will actually increase the tax take. It will basically increase the tax take, right? It increases the tax take for the government in the long run, and the government would easily be able to pay off those debts collected that it has now collected because of it ran into a deficit. Or maybe perhaps the tax take goes so much that it generates surplus tax revenue. It generates surplus revenue again, depending upon how much surplus tax revenue it generates. But what we're saying is that maybe in the long run, later on what happens is that because of the expansionary fiscal policy is very successful and it is totally effective, and what it does is that it brings the economy back on track, and a lot of tax take is collected or generated, and the government could whatever budget surplus that it had during the time when it was implementing an expansionary policy, could later on turn into even budget surplus, especially when we generate huge amount of surplus tax revenue if the economy grows subsequently, right? But that's ifs and buts, but we need to argue that in the exam. But anyways, ज़रूरी नहीं कि सारे के सारे points लिख कर आ जाएं that I'm discussing right now, but at least you can mention a few of these, ठीक है? The second thing, this is a very important point that you need to discuss about the crowding out effect. And the crowding out effect says that, what it says is that especially when the government when the government is borrowing money, because the government spending is borrowing fueled. The government is doing a large borrowing fueled government spending that could crowd out private sector investment, right? So I think that's basically known as crowding out effect. It crowds out private sector investment because when the government runs a budget deficit, it borrows money to finance its additional spending by issuing government bonds, and it issues these bonds to commercial banks or other financial institutions who would otherwise, and if commercial banks and other financial institutions buys those bonds, it needs to pay to the government, and the government uses that money to finance its spending. Now, these commercial banks and these other financial institutions would otherwise use those funds to lend private sector firms, but now they use those funds to buy government bonds. And our financial markets have limited pool of funds available, and we're calling them loanable funds, as in funds that need to be loaned out, which is simply the savings that are available for lending, right? And now with the government, when the government issues government bonds, the government enters the market as a large borrower from the commercial bank, and it sort of directly competes with the private sector firms for those funds, because otherwise the borrower is the private sector firms who borrows from commercial banks. Right now the government is borrowing from them by issuing bonds, so the government enters the market as a large borrower competing with private sector firms for those firms, and that increases the demand for those loanable funds, and that puts an upward pressure on interest rates, and the interest rates goes up. And as the interest rates goes up, right, borrowing becomes expensive now for private sector firms, especially for small and medium firms, right? And as a result, private sector firms investments, that is the I component of AD, falls, and so investments, guys, start declining. So what we're saying is that the government issues government bonds to commercial banks, and the government enters the market as a borrower and competes with the private sector firms for loanable funds, and that increases the demand for loanable funds, driving up the interest rates in the economy. And that what that does is that makes borrowing expensive, and it reduces the investments, and it is a disadvantage or a limitation, because what we are saying is, and so private sector firms are affected because now they mean, so see, private sector firms, see, when banks are allocating more funds to government debt, as in they're borrowing government bonds, fewer of those funds or loanable funds are available for the fewer of those loanable funds are remaining for private sector loans, right? So there's a limited pool of funds available, because, and simply what we're saying is that we don't have enough funds available now, because now the government has directly increased the demand for those funds. Initially those funds were demanded by the private sector, but now they're also demanded by the government, so there's a huge competition between the government and the private sector firms, and we have limited funds available, and that drives up the interest rates, because the demand for loanable funds goes up, and interest rates goes up, that reduces investment for private sector firms, and hence this is actually where fiscal policy becomes counterproductive. And the objective of the fiscal policy was to increase AD, but because of the crowding out effect, it reduces AD because investment goes up. So even if some AD goes up, then the crowding out effect would pull back that, offset that effect, and it would reduce growth because the I component of the AD equation would go down. And it might be possible that the fiscal policy would, when the crowding, this is a very important point to mention in the exam, and you will say is that the crowding out, if that crowding out effect happens, that would render your fiscal policy totally ineffective. Probably you won't be able to reduce the negative output gap and the recessionary gaps that you had. And the bigger the crowding out effect, the bigger the risk to enter into a deeper recession, right? So because of expansionary fiscal policy, you increase government spending, you ended up reducing taxes, and when you reduce taxes, your consumption went up, your investment spending went up, and you were able to bring the economy out of recession. But sooner or later, crowding out effect creeped in, and that brought back all the growth down back again. So it made your expansionary fiscal policy render totally ineffective. So this is a very, very strong argument to make in the exam against expansionary fiscal policy. The second thing, or the last thing that you also have to mention, crowding out effect, time lag, and these are 3-4 points you can, I mean, it's not that you mention all of this in so much detail, because obviously I'm explaining you in detail because I want to make clear your concepts, right? So the length of another thing that you can talk about is the length of the time lags, because you see, if the government decides to spend money, right, if the government is deciding to spend money on the economy, the thing is that it takes a long time for that money to actually start flowing around the economy. If the government is spending $1 billion on the economy in the form of government spending, and it is doing that, it is probably injecting fiscal stimulus or giving up stimulus packages, it takes time for the money to actually start flowing around the entire macroeconomy. For example, let's say the government spending to build schools will see, the government spending that if the government is spending money to, let's say, build schools, initially what will happen is that workers' wages would start going up, because people who are constructing that school, the wages would be paid, and probably the building material need to be bought. But it's not that it's, let's say if the government has decided to spend 100 million on building schools. So the government would not spend the entire 100 million in one go. It will pay wages, probably it will take steps to build the school, right? So probably buy some raw materials. It will take some time. The entire budget will not be spent straight away, which will actually limit to how much AT can increase in the immediate short run. The fact that this process will take time would limit how much AT will increase in the immediate short run. So what we're saying is that although expansive fiscal policy is effective, but we need to hang on and wait, and we can't completely rely on expansionary fiscal policy to bring the economy out of recession or to promote growth, right? Because there are time lags involved. What we're saying is that it's not that we won't get a big boost in AD. I mean, we will get a boost in AD, but we can't really expect a huge, significant boost in AD immediately in the immediate short run, because it will take time for the projects to be completed. We have to wait till then, right? It will take time for the projects to be completed and all the money to be spent, right? And it's not just about government spending. Also, through expansive fiscal policy, the government maybe reduces taxes to boost consumption, right? So even when even when the government reduces taxes, even those tax cuts take time to feed through the economy. It takes time for households to realize that tax have been cut, and that, to make them, because the consumer confidence is so low and there's so much pessimism in a recession that people, even because after tax cuts, people might not spend. And so it takes time for this to feed through them, and for the tax cuts to stimulate the economy through increasing consumption, because it takes time for households to spend, right? It takes time for households to spend. So, and it takes time for so even if income taxes are cut, there are time lags. And even for firms, if corporate taxes are reduced for firms to invest, to increase AD by increasing investments, so it will take time for firms to invest as well, and to realize that their retained profits are going up. And because, right, so how effective fiscal policy would depend upon the length of the time lags. Maybe it took a long time for fiscal policy to seep through the economy. So this is this time lag point is a very good, because now you need to explain time lags in the exam. A lot of students, what examiners usually find is that when students mention time lags, they just say that there are time lags without really explaining what do they really mean by when they say that there are time lags. So this is what you need to explain, not necessarily so much detail, but at least 1-2 lines on time lags. Because, and again, actually, when we talk about time lags, now this something that's just clicked. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that time lags, basically, in what context are we talking about time lags, is that we're saying that time lags, ek to implementation lag hota hai, there's an implementation lag. And the implementation lag is basically the time where the policy needs approval. The government has decided, but it takes time for it to be approved, right? So this is the implementation lag. And then you have the effect lag. The effect lag is basically when the policy actually starts to influence aggregate demand. So mentioning this would make you look so much better than all the other sort of candidates. Also, you could talk about the fact that government lacks profit motive, which means that the government could, even if the government is increasing spending, the government departments are not profit motivated, and there could be a lot of inefficiency in those departments, which means that they could end up doing wasteful spending. They might not know in what areas they need to spend to boost AD, and even if they know, then they might not deliberately try to reduce cost reductions, because government is not profit motivated. The profit motive is not the objective, and so deliberate cost reductions might not happen, and so there could be very high unnecessary costs involved and unnecessary spending to take place on projects that shouldn't have been done. Okay, guys, I hope you understood the limitations of expansive fiscal policy, and that's it for this video, guys. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, take care.